Welcome to the video on industry structure and external influence, a really important one, as this is the place where we discuss Michael Porter's 5 forces framework or 5 forces model, as well as something called the PESTLE, PESTLE framework for analyzing external influence. So industry structure is going to be covered via the 5 forces framework, or the 5 forces as envisaged by a guy called Michael Porter, whereas external influence will be analyzed using a framework called PESTLE, PESTLE. So we'll take them in turn. The two are used for different things, okay? One for industry structure, the other for analyzing external influences. Let's just say, beginning with Michael Porter's 5 forces, that if these forces prove to be intense or high, then it may be quite difficult to actually generate attractive returns in an industry. To generate attractive returns, the best place to be is in an industry which doesn't have strong forces that we're going to discuss now. Okay, so what are these, putting PESTLE to one side. Oh, and by the way, if this is your first encounter with the Let Me Explain YouTube channel, a warm welcome. Please consider subscribing to it, or even becoming a supporting member by clicking the join button. Then you get access to all the videos which are on the channel. Right, let's get cracking with Michael Porter's 5 forces framework. These forces are typically depicted. There are different ways in which you can do it. What typically happens is in the middle, so you kind of draw boxes or bubbles. In the middle, you're going to have rivalry among the companies who are already in the industry, so existing competitors. And then, to be honest, in no particular order, you're going to have the bargaining power of suppliers, typically on one side. On this, when I studied this many years ago, I had the bargaining power of the customers, the buyers. On the right, your book has this slightly differently. Over here, I'm going to say threat of new entrants. And over here, threat of substitutes. But, the order in which these are drawn is really of no importance. The actual headings are important, and you're supposed to sort of know what's hiding, what's lurking behind each one. So let's start with the threat of new entrants. Now, obviously, ideally, you want to be in an industry where you're most comfortable from a profit-making point of view, generating profits. If you're in an industry where that threat of new entrants is relatively low. So, in all cases, low is, if a threat or the bargaining power of your suppliers or customers, or the rivalry among existing firms in the industry, if that's low, that's going to be good grounds or good conditions to generate good profits. So when is the threat of new entrants lower? Well, it's lower if, for example, there are network effects associated with a given product or service, like the value to users grows as the number of users increases, and this is the case that we see with classic social media networks, or maybe ride-hailing apps like Uber or Bolt, or food delivery apps. The more people join and the more sort of restaurants or drivers join, the bigger the value to everybody. And it's very difficult, to break into such a market by a new entrant, because you have to build that network up. Another thing that's going to make the threat of new entrants lower is if we enjoy economies of scale, because those economies of scale are typically associated with large fixed costs. And really, if you have to spend a lot of money, invest a lot of money up front, have a high fixed cost bill, and initially you don't have enough revenue because you haven't grown your customer base yet, that's going to put off new entrants who may think about, about starting in that industry. Apart from economies of scale, there are also these things called economies of scope that we also discuss. I think it was in corporate issues, I'm not sure, or maybe within equity. Can't remember now. Where it's not the amount that you sell of a given product, but when you sell more products, you get economies because certain costs are shared between different product lines, for example. Something that also lowers the threat of new entrants is when we have a lot of customer loyalty. And of course, loyal customers will not necessarily switch to the product offered by a new entrant, and that's going to be especially the case if those products are highly differentiated. Well, differentiation typically breeds customer loyalty, but often there will also be specific switching costs involved. If you've been relying on software from a given supplier, there will be switching costs to switch to a software from a different supplier, including things like training, changing or switching procedures, and lots of stuff like that. What else? If the incumbents are the companies already industry, have access to some, rare inputs, hard to obtain inputs, then it's obviously going to be difficult for new entrants to get the same access. Or if the incumbents have special sort of custom customer interfaces, ways in which they communicate with customers. Think about suppliers to shops who have special networks via which they conduct business with shops. They may have agreements for specific shelves in shops being only for them. Then it's, once again, this makes the life of a new entrant quite difficult. And above that, there may be government sometimes policies which, for one reason or another, restrict entry into an industry. Restricting entry into industry in the name of, protecting domestic players, domestic producers, for example, or in the name of the industry being strategic, like defense. Okay, let's now move on to the threat of substitutes. And in this one, with this thread, let me just see where we are. We're over here. I think it's easier to actually talk about this from the perspective of when that threat is higher. It's sort of more logical or more instinctive to talk about it that way. That threat of substitutes is going to be obviously quite high if another product or service can fulfill the same or similar need. Now that may sometimes be very difficult to spot, but the COVID pandemic showed us that video conferencing is quite a good, let's say, substitute for face-to-face meetings, business travel, but also, for example, face-to-face training in a classroom that can now be done quite easily and is being done online. Okay, what else? If that substitute, of course, is not just if that product is not just a good substitute in terms of fulfilling a similar or the same need, but also offering in some way enhanced performance, if substitute offers better features, better performance, then that will of course make it even a higher threat. And it's also going to be a realistic threat if it is easy for customers to make the switch to that substitute. What constitutes an easy switch is of course going to be different for different people. It may be the question of mastering a new technology, a new interface, or something to do with investment in hardware and so on. Now, let's move on to the right-hand side here, the bargaining. This should have said, sorry, bargaining power. I omitted the power. Bargaining power of customers. Bargaining power of the customers. Now, from the point of view of a company that's supplying something to customers, you don't want your customers to have too much bargaining power or too much sway. And that bargaining power, once again, is going to be higher especially high if you only have a few very concentrated buyers. So if few concentrated buyers exist, then they will have a lot of sway over your decisions and over your pricing policy. Think about supermarket chains who buy from food producers. They have a lot of bargaining power. When the product is standardized, once again, the customer can relatively easy choose among many suppliers of the same thing. So once again, that increases their bargaining power at the expense of the supplying company. When the product is not critical to a customer, then you kind of have to convince them in the first place that it's needed. And I've been in the training business, in the corporate training business for years. Training is not a sort of mission critical service or thing for many businesses. When times get tough, it's easy to cut training expenses or freeze training budgets. So you have to really fight against that. Your customers have a lot of pricing power because they know they can go without training for quite some time, and then in the short run at least nothing terrible will happen. Now it's also bargaining power of customers is also high, and this may strike you as a little bit odd, but when the product is a large part of the customer's budget. Why? Because customers are much more picky then, and they will absolutely review the alternatives and they will negotiate the price. The more this is a large part of their budget, the more they will be inclined to really negotiate with you as the supplier and actually look at alternatives. If it's a small part of their budget, they may not be that bothered. Okay, and therefore you have your position is better as the supplier, and their bargaining power is also will be higher if customers can develop the same product in-house. And your curriculum gives a really nice example. Video streaming platforms like Netflix, for example, for many years were, at least initially, were reliant on film studios who would provide them with content. They would have to, negotiate the terms on which they bought the content from the video studios, which was then streamed. But then they started to develop their own video content films in-house, and now the tide has changed. The position has changed because they can do it themselves as well. So the bargaining power of the television studio, the bargaining power of somebody like Netflix has drastically increased. Obviously, we're now thinking about Netflix as the customer in that relationship, where the TV studios are the supplier and the streaming platforms are the customer. Okay, let's move on to the next one, because we've covered 3 so far. That's going to be the bargaining power of suppliers on the other side. Obviously, depending on where you put yourself, every company has typically both suppliers and customers, so you can be on either end of this relationship. The bargaining power of suppliers is higher if, once again, if there are few concentrated suppliers only. Think about semiconductors, chips made in a couple, 1 or 2 companies located mostly in Taiwan, If there is a high cost of switching suppliers, well, once again, that's going to make it difficult for the company to negotiate with somebody else or make the decision to switch. And if there is no realistic substitute of the product being supplied, then once again the bargaining power of the supplier is quite high. I mean, there is I think an example that's not in your book, but talking about semiconductors or modern chips, there is a company in Holland, in the Netherlands, in Europe, that makes equipment for the production of semiconductors, and it makes the most, let's say, innovative product, and everybody who wants to make chips needs to have access to their technology. So as a supplier, their bargaining power is absolutely up there in the sky. And the final of these considerations, the final of the forces, is rivalry among the existing competitors. Now, once again, I'm going to focus on what makes that rivalry, or what makes that force quite high. Rivalry among existing competitors. And by the way, if you're into this kind of thing, this kind of strategic thinking, I strongly recommend you pick up the original text by Michael Porter. I had to read it when I was a student of business many years ago, like 20-something years ago. It's a really great book. And it will get you to view and think about different things in a completely different way. So rivalry among existing competitors, it's going to be higher if the product is standardized. When we all sell the same thing, we typically fight because there is no other way than to fight with price, for example, to get customers over, and that increases the rivalry within the industry. If there are high barriers, this says barriers, but barriers to exit, right? Be careful not to make the mistake of thinking about entry. Barriers to entry reduce rivalry because they stop new entrants from coming in. But the barriers to exit stop people leaving the industry because they've invested so much, for example, that it makes it difficult for them to leave without suffering huge losses, or other barriers to exit like existing relationships with customers that cannot be just severed, that cannot be cut, may also stop them from exiting. And that means more of us stay in the industry. Also, numerous equal-sized competitors. That doesn't help. If lots of companies have roughly the same share of the market, that will intensify the fight between them. And slow growth, or no growth at all, that's also something that intensifies competition, and therefore has a negative impact on profitability. Because in an industry that's growing quite dynamically, we don't really have to fight each other. We can just do our own stuff, and we'll keep growing. But when the industry stops growing at the same pace, it's no longer so dynamic. We have to start fighting one another to take market share away from one another, because that's the only condition under which we will grow. When the market is growing, you don't have to really think that much about your competitors, and you'll grow anyway, providing your product is good. Once that growth stalls, you have to think about how to snatch customers from your rivals. Right. So that's Michael Porter's 5 forces in a very sort of telegraphic summary. Let's now focus on the PESTLE framework for analyzing external influences. These are going to be, as your book puts it, external influences, but influences on industry growth, not necessarily, the competition within the industry, but just industry growth as such. So these will come, this is obviously just one way of looking at it, but the one that's discussed in the book, in the form of a framework known as PESTLE analysis. There is an L missing, sorry. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 letters, and each of them stands for a specific influence. So the first one is political influences, which may impact industry, growth. Right. When we say political, that has a relatively broad meaning here. It could be fiscal, as in the politics of government. It could be monetary policy, which is typically conducted by the central bank. Interest rate changes as done by central banks under their monetary policy mandates have a huge impact on the banking industry, the cost of credit, etc. So obviously that's a huge concern or consideration for banks, a risk or a factor to take into account. Right. When we talk about fiscal, we mean government, and governments have a budget which a purchasing budget. Governments buy a lot. They sometimes sell things like licenses to do various things in a given area. But the purchasing aspect, right? Defense purchasing, defense buying is done by governments pretty much. Healthcare buying, a huge part of it is done by government. Education services buying is done by government. So that impacts the industries. Under political influences, you could think about regulatory changes, but also geopolitical conditions, actions. Think about, if you're watching this in 2024, after the presidential election in the United States, the whole talk of tariffs being introduced on imports to the US, that's a concern for many industries outside of the US, of course. and in the US as well, but kind of maybe as a bit of an opportunity. Your book cites the energy transition as an example of geopolitical conditions. Okay, next influence from the PESTLE framework. So we've got the P. Next one is economic influences. And these are, once again, a pretty broad category. So, what's happening to GDP, up or down, or, typically GDP grows, but at what pace? What's happening to personal income of consumers, right? What's happening with inflation? What's happening with interest rates? What's happening with foreign exchange rates? All of these are sort of macroeconomic influences or variables, and they will be especially important for those industries which we typically describe as cyclical. Those are the ones that go up and down quite a lot when conditions in the markets or in the economy change. Industries. And of course, maybe less important, nevertheless still quite important, but less important for the so-called defensive sectors or defensive industries. Right, I've discussed this before, so I'm not going to do it again. Then we've got social influences. Remember, PES, then T, so social. These are things like cultural changes, consumer trends, people moving to different ways, different ways of spending time, different ways of eating, maybe eating more takeaways instead of cooking, or going less to restaurants in favor of takeaways, going less to the cinema in favor of watching stuff at home, stuff like that. Lifestyle changes, maybe more sort of fitness or demographic changes. Lots of people nowadays are thinking about whether various gyms and fitness studios will survive now that customers have access to weight loss drugs. That's an example of a social change that may impact an entire industry or affect its growth rate. Then we've got the T, technological. Can't spell technological apparently. Technological influences. Okay. And that's that's quite, I guess, self-explanatory. However, just need to be aware of the fact that technological influences can come, or changes can come about in two forms. Sustaining and disruptive, and of course disruptive is what a lot of people talk about, disruptive technologies, but there are also sustaining ones. This is all about improvements or additions of, let's say, additional features or marginal features, but to existing products, to existing services. So we can make a TV with an even with an even higher resolution or refresh rate or whatever. And this kind of change or this kind of advancement typically comes from the incumbents, so the companies already present in the industry. And then you've got something completely different, that's disruptive technology changes or influences. This is where we create a completely new market, creating a new market, or actually entering an existing one, but with a proposition, sort of value proposition for the customer, which is often very different to what's already there. Very different. And often it's so different that the existing customers of a certain sector or industry do not find this new proposition appealing because they're used to the old way of doing things. For example, when video streaming came about, it wasn't as if everybody said, yes, that's so good. It took time for video streaming to replace, largely DVDs or Blu-ray discs or whatever, else. Very often, disruptive changes come, or typically come, from new entrants. Why? Because those new entrants do not have existing profits to protect. That do not have existing profits to protect. It's not like, TV stations would come up with the idea of streaming because that would kill their existing business, so why do it? But a new entrant who has nothing to lose, no market to lose, is going to be much more inclined to take on the challenge. And in association with this, please be aware of the concept of the innovator's dilemma. And that's a concept related to the incumbent, somebody who's already in the industry. They can absolutely invest in a disruptive technology, but they're less inclined to do so because if they develop this disruptive technology, this will speed up the decline of their existing business. So, often, it's the new entrants who do that investment and reap the benefits, but also face the risk of it not going well, of this proving to be tricky. Now, we're on PEST, so just LE to complete the PESTLE. Legal influences. Right, these are once again quite broad. They sometimes, you can think about them as very much linked to political, because we talked about, for example, your regulatory changes there as well. This is all about changes to laws, regulations, of course. So a lot of overlap with the first category, especially big for those industries or sectors where there is a lot of legal boundaries put in place, like alcohol, for example, tobacco, healthcare, some types of healthcare. Cannabis is an interesting one that's mentioned by your book, where cannabis is being legalized in some places, not in others. And one more, of course, to complete the whole framework, that's environmental influences. And the curriculum here says, well, these are changes or trends associated with changes to or from lower carbon economy transition. Things. I mean, this list will not be comprehensive. Waste production, or how much waste we produce, how much stuff we generate. Obviously, waste here being the byproduct. How we use land, especially forest land. How agriculture is being performed, and all of that. So this, once again, there is a lot of overlap between environmental, legal, and political here. At least I think so. And anyway, you just have to know these 6 letters from the PESTLE framework and what's behind each one. And I'm sure I'm quite confident I've given you enough food for thought there now to understand what's going on in each category.